Today I have Terry Stokes with me. Terry, you're an associate pastor at a church in New Jersey, and I'm sure you do lots of other things in the world. One of those things that you have done recently, though, is you've written an incredible book. Actually, it very well might end up being in my top favorite books of 2024. It's so freaking good. But it's called Jesus and the Abolitionists: How Anarchist Christianity Empowers the People. This is literally like all the things that I love about theology and Christianity, like coming together in one book. You basically wrote like the book that I would love to write in the world. So you already stole my thunder, which is totally fine. But yeah, Terry, I'd love to hear a little bit more about you. So who's Terry Stokes to Terry Stokes?
Yeah, absolutely. And just by way of beginning to answer this question, I'll give a little update to my bio, which is that probably at the time that you received the bio, or that at the time the bio was written, I was an associate pastor at a church in
Oh,
Central Jersey, but I left that job about a year ago,
okay.
and since June of last year, I've been working at a Christian nonprofit that runs an after-school program and a summer camp in
Oh, cool.
Trenton, New Jersey. So
Sweet.
that's what I'm doing in the world these days, and yeah, it's a great opportunity to do ministry. I was doing youth ministry before, I'm doing youth ministry now. I really
Heck
have
yeah.
a great amount of contact time with the young people, and it just it allows me to be in Black and brown communities among poor working class people, which is something that I've been growing a heart for over the past few years. So I'm
Love it.
grateful that I have been given this opportunity.
That's great. Well,
Yeah.
I used to work with youth as well. I worked as a essentially youth pastor at a kind of progressive church in the Twin Cities. So I live in Minneapolis. So
Okay.
yeah, I definitely have my roots in youth ministry, youth work as well. So solidarity to the fellow youth worker.
Yes.
That's great. Well, let's dive into the book. Again, I think it's so good. So I really want to make this as much of a introduction to anarchism, because I would imagine, even though my listeners of the podcast would probably be, maybe vaguely familiar with anarchism, I really would love to dive more into it. So I want to make this as introductory as possible for anarchism, and especially how Christianity can connect to anarchism, how our people of faith, specifically Christians, can be a part of anarchist movements, that kind of thing. So
Mhm.
let's dive in right away to what is anarchism. Let's make it a nice little softball kind of question for you right away.
Absolutely. I'll give two definitions. One would be the more standard definition that you'll hear, and then another one is one of my favorites that I've heard along my journey of studying
Okay.
anarchism. So, a man named Vishwam Eckert, I believe I'm pronouncing that correctly, gives the definition of anarchism as the art of relating freely as equals.
Ooh.
And I really like that because it kind of expands it beyond sort of the narrowly political understanding of anarchism that is more common.
Mm-hmm.
And so that within that realm, the definition would be a political system without rulers. If we're looking at it in the most purely etymological sense, if arc is ruler and an is a negation, then it's just not rulers or no
Mm-hmm.
rulers. So those are the two definitions that I kind of work from.
Interesting. I love that sort of poetic one. Who is that again?
Yeah, his name is Vishwam Eckert. He was a contributor to an anthology of essays called Queering Anarchism that I read last year.
Okay.
And that definition I heard in a podcast episode that he was on. I think the podcast is called Everyday Anarchism.
Mm.
I'll double check that. But yeah, when I heard that, I was just kind of compelled, and I fell in love with that.
Yeah, that's beautiful. That's beautiful. Well, let's talk about how you got into anarchism to begin with. Obviously, your journey has been, some time, where obviously you're spending, a great deal of, thinking about anarchism, trying to practice it in your own life. So, yeah, can you talk a little bit about how you even maybe first heard about it and just what your journey has been since?
Absolutely. Yeah. So I grew up fairly conservative, evangelical,
Okay.
and I went to Princeton Seminary starting in 2017. And so that was really the first progressive environment that I had ever
Mm-hmm.
been in. And so that was sort of the beginning of me sort of being broken down and being built back up in terms of my worldview more broadly. And then coming towards the end of my time in seminary, My last semester was spring 2020. And so we were on spring break when the world shut down.
Mm-hmm.
And for the next few months, I had all this time to kind of look back on the worldview development journey that I'd been on to that point, and also witnessing the latest iteration of the Black Lives Matter and Black liberation
Mm-hmm.
movements, sort of being radicalized by the murder of George Floyd and other things that were going on around the country. And so I read The End of Policing by Alex
Mm-hmm.
Tale.
Yeah, and I think it was around that time too that it like ended up being free, so that
Yeah,
like it became a very widely read book,
yeah,
obviously in the aftermath of George Floyd being murdered.
exactly. Yeah. So that the fact that they made it free for that time period was, I don't know if I would have would have checked it out if it wasn't.
Right.
So that was kind of my journey into the beginning of my journey into abolitionism, and then kind of went from there into what else did I read during that time? The autobiography of Angela Davis.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I read a book called Mutual Aid by Dean Spade. So all these works that were solely kind of taking me down the path of leftism, socialism, communism. And then towards the end of 2022, I was talking with a friend of mine about all the things I've been reading and thinking about. And I had told her that I read the Mutual Aid book, and she said, "Oh, yeah, a lot of my anarchist friends, their whole thing is mutual aid." And I was like, "Ooh, anarchism, that's something that's kind of like this like spooky word that I've heard and never really looked into." So after that conversation, I think I looked up the first thing on Wikipedia, went down the rabbit trail with that, and then ended up finding a guy named Murray Bookchin,
Mm.
who is one of the more recent big names within anarchist philosophy. And I read some introductory articles by him, and then fast forward a couple of months, I'm starting to see all these different connections between the kinds of values and ideas that I was having presented to me through anarchism, and then these values and beliefs that I had grown up with, or sort of had been like reconstructing in the past
Mm.
few years within Christianity.
Mm-hmm.
So at that point, I wrote a first draft of this book that's coming out in a few months, over a 5-day period. It was almost as if I was like channeling it and like receiving it rather than constructing it. And yeah, ever since then, I've just been enjoying continuing to make those connections.
Right. Wow. That's amazing. So it's a fairly recent journey for you, which is really
Yeah.
lovely. And I think it would have been around the time that I started specifically getting into anarchism as well. I still remember, again, living in Minneapolis, I was very involved with a lot of like the George Floyd protests
Yeah.
that were going on. And I still remember specifically the night before. It was the night that the precinct was burnt down.
Mm.
I wasn't at that, but I was there right at the precinct, like hours before it ended up being burnt down. But I still remember it was sort of in the aftermath of like, all like the whole city was sort of, there was just like, there was a lot of like chaos going on. But there, in like the middle of this, there was this moment of, where like you literally look across the street and Target had been like, people had taken stuff from Target, and there was all these, there's a grocery store right there, so people had taken stuff from this grocery store. And I just remember thinking to myself, like, here is like the first time where it feels like people are able to like get the things they need without having to like give away their like bodies for labor, for like where it literally like there was like a stand at that moment where if you needed diapers for your child, or if you needed like um you know um whatever it was, like just any sort of like need you had,
Mhm.
like you could just have it.
Yeah.
And you like didn't need to like give away yourself or a part of
Mhm.
yourself in order to just like get what you need in order to survive. And that
Yeah.
was like the first moment where I realized, oh wait, like we could structure a world like this if we need to and we
Yeah.
want to.
Yeah.
And it was like the first sort of glimpse I had to that. And I often think about it where you hear this, like these times where Jesus is like, the kingdom of God is at hand. Like it was like this glimpse where it felt like, wow, like this is the at hand that Jesus meant. Like obviously there's many times where we don't see the kingdom of God at hand, but
Right.
like this felt like one of those times, even in the midst of all the chaos and all the things that were going on at that time,
Mhm.
it just felt like this glimpse into that. And I still like think back to like this was like the first moment where I've really experienced this sort of like anarchist
Mhm.
kingdom of God, that
Mhm.
I just was like, oh my goodness, like we could live so much differently.
Right. Wow, that's a beautiful entry point. Um, yeah, I love that story. Wow.
Yeah. So, one of the objections I often hear about anarchism is that it's just chaos, right? Like I was talking about, like there
Mhm.
was this kind of chaos that was going on during like the
Right.
protests in the aftermath of George Floyd being killed, and so oftentimes you hear about like anarchism being considered chaos. In fact, like oftentimes you hear chaos and anarchy being like synonymous words
Yeah, used
with one another,
interchangeably.
right? So can you talk about like what anarchism has looked like throughout communities that have done it, that where it's not chaos, right? Like there's
Mhm.
actually like there's some sort of level of order and relationship that's happening and mutuality that's happening, and it's not just
Mhm.
purely chaos.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up. That's really within the first few pages of almost every book on anarchism that I've read, the author makes sure to bring that up. Identify that common misconception and get that handled and straightened out right off the bat. Um, because there has been a concerted campaign on the part of those who misunderstand or stand to lose something
Mhm.
by the
Mhm.
popularization of anarchism.
Mhm.
A concerted effort on the part of those people to sort of a smear campaign to associate anarchism with that which it is not, in order to discredit it. So in terms of real life examples of anarchic principles or anarchistic principles at work that sort of dispel that notion. I think of the most uh, I would say the most well documented and the farthest reaching anarchist movement in recent history, which was leading up to the Spanish Civil War.
Mm.
There was a yeah a the arrival of anarchism as a social and political philosophy to Spain in the late 1800s, I think late 1870s, started a movement of anarcho-syndicalists,
Mhm.
which is sort of the um, combination of the political worldview of anarchism with syndicalism, which is a movement centered around labor unions, trade unions. So that movement took root and grew really rapidly and broadly across Spain, leading up to the Spanish Civil War, when a lot of folks were persecuted and that movement was sent underground. So within that movement, especially in the years leading up to the Spanish Civil War, you started to see um, the syndicates, the labor unions, take over entire towns, entire cities, and sort of operate in the way that you described, witnessing in the days surrounding the events around George Floyd. You started to see these unions organizing food distribution through free cooperatives. You started to
Mhm.
see um, um, political education arranged for workers that wouldn't otherwise have been able to access education. You started to see consensus-based decision-making processes put in place. You saw the expropriation of land and factories away from landlords and capitalists, put in the
Mhm.
hands of these committees that would make decisions through the participation of the entire community. Um, yeah, so you could start to see the glimpses of what anarchy could look like on a larger scale. Um, and so that when I think of like anarchy as an ordered process, as people relating freely as equals, rather
Mhm.
than the chaos and the violence that it's typically depicted as, that's one of the
Right.
first things that comes to mind.
Yeah, oftentimes, yeah, there is this like level of chaos and even like implied violence that happens where if there's going to be an anarchist takeover, there is violence that is involved in that. One of the things you mentioned was that there was consensus building in this particular example, and I'm very influenced by Quakerism, and obviously a part of the Quaker tradition is this sort of consensus building where they do not make decisions unless there's consensus, right?
Mhm.
And that does seem to be a part of at least some traditions within the anarchist movements throughout history. And I'd love to hear a little bit more about that because, again, a lot of people might have this assumption that anarchism means like violence, and the only way to make somebody be involved in your movement or to make decisions within your movement is to commit violence against them, and
Mhm.
that doesn't seem to be the case at all. Like actually, a lot of it is consensus building, which is
Mhm.
like even more difficult and more in some ways like non-violent work than
Yeah,
you would even see where you have like people that disagree with each other and just whoever outvotes the other person, or whatever, now all of a sudden gets the power and control. And
exactly.
but within consensus building, and there is such deep relationship that has to happen in order
Absolutely.
for consensus to actually be formed.
Yes. Yes, that's so well put. And there's so many threads that I want to pull on there and see if I hopefully don't forget all of them. But you talk about how consensus-based decision making requires deep relationship, and I think that is one of the things that I see stand out the most in the anarchist movements that I've studied. You see these affinity groups. The concept of an affinity group actually began within the Spanish anarchist movement.
Mm.
Um, and so you see these affinity groups that basically become like, you know, a church small group where not only are you doing actions together, not only are you taking political actions together, but you're also sharing meals together. You're building intentional community. You're kind of building a life together. And so that was the thing that made that movement so cohesive in a way that the socialist movement and the communist movement and these other similar radical movements in Spain weren't able to accomplish in the same way. So I think that is such an important aspect of how to make anarchism workable, because so many times people will say like, well, that sounds really nice, but that doesn't seem workable. um, and people will often even point to consensus based decision making as something that seems so unworkable. Like, what if one person just stands in the way and blocks everything?
Mhm.
Well, if you're building that deep relationship between everyone and you're really sharing your life together, that sort of you know avoids and to a large extent th- this outcome where you have folks who are coming together for maybe one part of their lives and aren't connected in these other parts of their
Mhm.
lives, and so
Mhm.
there's these other disconnects that lead to those kinds of situations.
Mhm.
But yeah, overall, um, it's it really comes down to a particular view of human nature. I think, seeing it, your perspective on whether consensus decision making can work, your perspective on whether anarchism can work, really comes down to, what do you believe about human beings? Do you believe
Mhm.
that in healthy circumstances that human beings will be cooperative, that they will help one another, that they will try to act in each other's best interests? Or do you believe that in good circumstances or bad circumstances, people will be self-centered, that that they'll try to dominate one another, try to rule one another? And so many of the conversations I have with people about the workability, the possibility of these kinds of things really comes down to that question.
Right, right. Well, that we'll probably get into the theology side of things, but I can imagine there's a lot of yeah, they're depending on your assumption of that human nature is obviously really related to theology as well, right? And so I'm sure we'll get into that as well here in a little bit. Before we do that, you mentioned a little bit about mutual aid.
Mhm.
And that might be something that is a new concept for people listening to this. And I'd love for you to talk a little bit about what mutual aid is and why it is different than just like simply charity.
Yeah, yeah, that was I think, a whole chapter in the Dean Spade book that I read, which I highly recommend to listeners. It's short. It's written in very accessible, simple language. And so, yeah, so mutual aid, I wish I remembered the exact definition that he gave, but, you know, in my own words now, I would say it's, you know, people getting together to help one another out without having to appeal to, I would say, outside organizations that are not part of their community. So a community coming together to help each other meet their basic needs is sort of how I would describe mutual aid. Sorry, what was your second question with
Just
that?
how it's different than charity then.
Oh, yeah. So yeah, charity, you know, Dean Spade makes a point to point out that charity is people that have means helping or giving to those who do not have means. So there's a generosity to it at its best, but there's not a reciprocity and there's not power building all around. It's sort of like a give a person a fish versus teaching a person to fish kind of situation. So yeah, he goes through a lot of different examples of how organizations, and, you know, the nonprofit industrial complex, as some people call it, are built on this charity model where you have a wealthy person who donates money, and then that person, whether formally or informally, pulls the strings on what that organization is then able to do. The grants that the organization applies for that are paid for by these donors have certain deliverables attached to them that come from the worldview and the mindset of those people. And so even though there is some changing of hands of resources and things like that, the overall sort of political vision behind it stays the same, and even sometimes gets entrenched all the more. As opposed to mutual aid, where you know, everyone is a leader, everyone has a role to play, and everyone's power is built by them realizing that they do have something to bring, they do have something to offer to other people.
It reminds me of a conversation I had recently where a friend was saying that her neighbor has this great like garden of different, like, and you know, it was in the summer and there was like some fruits and stuff that were being made or that were being produced at this garden. And so she was like helping, you know, she's a good neighbor, you know, just wanting to help out her friend and helping out with this garden. So all these great fruits that were coming out during the summer of this garden. And so her friend was like, wow, I mean, you've been helping me out with this. Like, here's some of the fruits that, you know, some apples and peaches or whatever it was, right? And so this friend gets all these fruits and then makes like, you know, apple pie or peach pie or whatever, and then realizes, wait, I got way more apple and peach pie than I ever need, and then starts giving it back out to all these other neighbors around the neighborhood. And it's like, to me, this is like a great example of this is what anarchism is. It's like people being in relationship with each other, helping each other out, in loving each other, and we all in that we create abundance. We have more than what we need, and we help each other out and freely give with one another. And to me, that's just like a great example of what this could look like. And yet we've created there's systems around the world where, no, if you help me out, you have to do this thing for me, and it's just that there's all this sort of transactional based stuff that happens. And it's like, what if we just freely did all of this because we loved each other and cared about each other and want to be in relationship with each other? And that's what the world could look like, right?
Absolutely. Yeah, many anarchists talk about a gift-based economy rather than an exchange economy, and it speaks very much to what you were saying about how when you break down our most basic economic assumptions, it comes down to, is there enough or is there not enough? And can we really put a value on things or time, or can we not? Because if you really think about anything, really, like a flower, a book, this microphone, and you think about, okay, I bought this microphone for $200. That was just a price that was agreed upon by all these like invisible forces,
Right.
and it's really just capitalism just boils down to vibes, really.
Right.
It comes down to arbitrary values that we place on things and on our time. But really, when you peel back those layers, you realize you can't really put a value on those things. And so if I can't put a value on things, then I can't really have an exchange-based economy. It really has to be based on generosity and love and solidarity for people. And that's really the basis of what mutual aid is. And so when you scale that up to a level of entire economy and entire community, and you have all people's needs being met through I was going to say the exchange. This shows how deeply embedded that mindset is, through the giving of gifts to each other based off of some resources that this person has, some resources that this person has, the work that this person loves to do, but maybe this person doesn't love to do. Then you begin to see how to build a reality that that does not need to rely on exchange, doesn't need to rely on the wage system, doesn't need to rely on any of these things that we take as so written in stone.
Right. Yeah. Sometimes you hear, or I've heard from like kind of more capitalist sort of folks where if we went back to like anarchism, or if we go to something like socialism or whatever it was, whatever it is, one of their arguments is, just like we would have to like live like we're in the 1800s again or something, right? Like that we're on like a little homestead and we're farming, and like my argument against that is, just as much as there is a person in the world where if you gift them with some peaches and some apples, they're going to want to make apple pie out of the generosity of their own heart. There's going to be people in the world that are going to want to make a microphone. Like
Right.
that is
Yeah.
the thing that they feel like they can offer the world, right?
Yeah.
And be a part. So there's just absolutely no way in my mind that we would have to like go back to a world where we're just living like agrarian farmers in the
Right.
1600s or whatever. Like there are ways that we could think of where people are going to offer the gifts that they've been given, and
Yeah.
they want to offer that to the world, as
Right.
long as they know that they're not going to have to be fighting for their own survival.
That's it. That's the key thing. I'm so glad you said that, because when you know that your basic needs are going to be met, it totally changes your attitude towards work and towards vocation, your
Right.
calling, and the things that you like to spend your time doing. Right.
Mm-hmm.
That's why the concept of like a starving artist exists, is because there are people who love doing a certain thing so much that they would do that thing even
Right.
if their basic needs weren't met. So imagine everyone's basic needs being met, and all of a sudden you have the person who was put on this earth to create microphones, the person who was put on this earth to do the thing that you might think is boring or tedious, but to them is artistic. It's a beautiful way to spend their time. And so yeah, it's easy to think that anarchism requires primitivism, and there is there are anarcho-primitivists, but that in my study, that's a small community within the larger movement.
Right.
And Murray Bookchin, who I mentioned at the beginning, one of his big things throughout his whole career was kind of presenting anarchism not as a return to some bygone golden era, not as a primitivist thing, but as something that allows us to use technology in a more liberated way, and to advance more towards higher and higher technologies that actually meet our needs, rather than serving systems that don't meet our needs.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm glad you bring up that point, because specifically the point of like, people fall in love with something in the world that they want to do, and they want to contribute to the world. And a lot of times, what's interesting is a lot of times, like the thing that they fall in love with, maybe when they're a child or an adolescent, and then they go to college, and then they actually end up pursuing that as a career, and they now their relationship with that thing has changed, because now it goes from I love this because that for the sake of loving it to
Hmm.
now I have to love this in order to pay the bills.
Right.
And that is a significant change in that relationship where, think of like somebody who loves to cook, right?
Mhm.
That person might have fallen in love with cooking, maybe cooking with their family during the holidays when they were a child or an adolescent. And then they are like, well, I want to do this for a living. Like, this is what I want to do in the world. And
Mhm.
then they show up to a restaurant and now they're a sous chef and they're just, for hours on end, just chopping onions. And that's the only way that they're able to live in an apartment and put
Right.
food on their own table and,
Yeah.
so on and so forth. And all
Mhm.
of a sudden that changes their relationship with their love for cooking, right?
Mhm.
And
Yeah.
and so it's like, what if people were able to freely do that, where they don't have to actually do it for their survival, but they do it
Right.
because they love to do this.
100%. Yeah. It's something that would totally revolutionize everything, and that would be one of the things that would, I think, in my view, open people up to other aspects of anarchism, if there could be that aspect of um that aspect of anarcho-communism, aspect um, demonstrated in small ways, and it is, there are, many ways in many communities around the world where that kind of thing exists in some form,
Mm-hmm.
uh, however small, but that's the kind of thing where that would radicalize people and that would open them up to utopian thinking.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Let's get into the theology side of stuff. Obviously, again, you do a lot of connections with anarchism and Christianity. So, can you talk about, you actually really start out that part of your book talking about God and the Trinity as a sort of like anarchist model. Can you talk specifically why God, by God's nature, is an anarchist?
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. I really wanted to tackle that question first because historically a lot of anarchists are atheists, and there's
Right.
a common slogan, no gods, no masters. And so for me, as I was trying to reconcile these two systems that have given me life and have um, made the world alive to me, that was the first thing that I really needed to work out. How can I still hold on to God and my relationship with God, my ideas of God, while rejecting the idea of God as a ruler,
Mm.
as someone who uses coercion and punishment to accomplish their purposes. Um, and so, yeah, that's kind of the first thing that I tackle in the theology section of the book. And so, what I found and sort of stumbled onto along the way is, of course, within our tradition, there are so many other um, metaphors for God, analogies for God, characteristics and aspects of God. And so leaning more into God as a friend, God as a lover, God as a parent. Um, these other aspects of God is one thing that you can do, but then also on when it comes to deconstructing these viewpoints of God that don't seem to fit with an anarchist worldview, um, it sort of led me to questions about scripture, because
Mm.
anytime that we want to like reconstruct our theology around anything, it often involves reinterpretation or constructing a new lens through which to read scripture. And so, revisiting all of these texts that seem to present God as, wrathful, violent, domineering, um, I had to I had to reckon with the humanity of scripture more than I think I ever had to that
Mm.
point. I had to reckon with the like organic way that texts are produced and transmitted across time, where, for example, I think one of the things I say, or one of the like ideas that I present in the book, is that, what if living in a domination oriented society leads someone to the point where God says, I would like you to do this, and they hear it as go do this, and if you don't, I'll punish you. You
Mm.
know, there's ways in which we hear God automatically through the assumptions of our culture, right? And that's unavoidable as human beings who live in communities and societies. So, you know, just kind of tinkering with that idea of how inspiration works, and whether or not it's actually just a natural part of the process, that our ways of hearing God and depicting God in our texts, in our traditions, naturally are filtered through these worldviews, in the same way that they will be refiltered and reconstructed when we hopefully progress beyond those kinds of assumptions about what is the best way to order our societies, what's the best way to solve conflicts. Is it to punish, or is it to repair?
Mm.
You know, delving into these questions, working out different answers, helps us to go back and to see God in different ways.
Mm-hmm. I think also what's interesting, specifically for Christians who believe God is triune,
Mm-hmm.
is that you have this idea that God is one and
Mm-hmm.
many, you know,
Mm-hmm.
one and three at the same time.
Mm-hmm.
And so within this nature of God that Christianity proposes is this unity, this oneness, and also this diversity at the
Mm-hmm.
same time. And so you have both of that, but both unity and diversity, oneness and many happening at the same time. And I think again, it's very similar to anarchism, where you've got this unity or this common goal, this common trajectory. There's this oneness, this shared humanity that you have. There's this sharedness. So there's this oneness going on in anarchism, but also recognizing that every individual has their own gifts. They have their own things that they're going to contribute to the world, and that they're their own person in ways as well. So there's this manyness as well that's in anarchism. And so I think God in this, specifically this model of the Trinity. I'm not really interested in what Trinitarian heresy I probably am talking about right now. But what I do really love is the fact that there's this oneness and there's this manyness that's going on, and I think that's also really reflected in anarchism as well.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think the fact that God is a community in God's self is one of the most compelling things that keeps me showing up in the church, in this faith journey. Um, this idea that, you know, even before the creation of the world, that there was this dynamic interplay of voices, perspectives, but also this perfect self-giving
Mm-hmm.
between the persons of the Trinity. And that was something that I immediately connected to. Okay, if God has always been this way, then naturally God deciding to create a world would create a world to operate and exist in that same way.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, that's definitely been a guiding sort of a reconceptualization for me.
Yeah. Yeah. If God is relational in God's self, because again, in a triune God, there's three persons. If God
Mhm.
is relational in God's self, then it makes perfect sense that God would also want to be in relationship with those outside of God's
Mhm.
self, right? And
Right.
and so therefore creating a world. And
Mhm.
so yeah, this the whole relationality that's within the Trinity. It's probably part of the reason why I still want to remain a Christian is the fact that,
Mhm.
you know, whether or not God actually exists as a triune God or not, I don't know. There's no way I can know that. But
Mhm.
what I do find compelling about it is the fact that I think there's just so much reflection to that we see in the world, in creation, and in some of these systems like anarchism.
Absolutely. Yeah, and there's challenges to Trinitarianism. You know, it's been a stumbling block for so
Totally.
many of the greatest thinkers, religious thinkers, you know, in history. And so, like, even recently, I've been asking myself, okay, so, you know, I have this strong claim and sort of foundation in this triune God and the relationality and all the beautiful aspects of that. But then how do I understand that in conversation with sort of what I was just talking about a second ago with okay, human beings grow up and live in societies that have assumptions that that cause harm. And so even Jesus as a human being, like, could Jesus be a human being without having that experience? And so when I read statements in the Gospels, statements from Jesus that seem to preach punishment, seem to preach coercion, seem to not fit with this theology that I've been constructing, this anarchist Christianity. That's sort of the sticking point that I get to. But nonetheless, like you said, even though I don't have assurance about that question when it really comes down to it, but I have this desire to work it out, this desire to believe in it, that keeps me taking one step forward at a time. And I think that's really the most important thing.
You just talked a little bit about Jesus and some of these moments where you're like, ooh, I don't know if that really completely fits with my sort of anarchist commitments. But I'd love to hear more on the inverse of that. Like, what are the moments that you see throughout maybe the Gospels where you see Jesus kind of maybe living out these anarchist commitments? Obviously, knowing that he's not like an anarchist theorist or anything, right? Like that he far predates all of that. But there are kind of these little moments where you start seeing this resonance of, oh, that kind of gives me the vibe of an anarchist.
Absolutely. Yeah. Oh man. How much time do you have?
All the time you need.
So, I mean, I think the first thing that comes to mind is sort of the overall structure of Jesus's movement. And this is one of like the cool contributions that I make to anarchist Christianity in my book. Cause, it is something that, of course, predates me. And, you have your Leo Tolstoys and Jacques Ellul's and all these great Christian anarchists from history. But I think, maybe a unique contribution that I make, or that I haven't seen anywhere else, is the observation that Jesus is spiritually centralized or central in his movement, but he is politically and socially decentralized in his movement. And that comes to the fore most when he sends out the 72, and, sends them out with the power to do the same kinds of miracles and signs that he's been doing, and more, even, arguably more importantly, to do the same kind of community organizing that he's been doing, going to a village, showing up at synagogue, standing up when they ask if anyone has anything to say, sharing the good news about God's kingdom being at hand, and then doing these signs and wonders as a way of demonstrating and sort of reinforcing what you're saying. And so, I think that Jesus decentralizes himself and sort of decenters, removes himself from the axis of the movement by doing this, so that his movement becomes this mutual aid sort of power building thing, rather than having to socially and politically hinge on one person that knows that he's not going to be around to see the movement go as far as it is going to go. So I think that's one of the first things that I think of when I think of Jesus being sort of the proto-anarchist, or someone who demonstrates anarchistic principles in action.
Right. What's interesting is one of those Gospels that talks about the sending of the 72 is John, which John is very known for elevating Jesus, right? Like Jesus is basically God, is what the, Johannine authors are wanting to really kind of create that image of Jesus. What's interesting is, okay, so Jesus sends out the 72, I think it's John 10, and then a few chapters later, Jesus even says, you will all do greater things than even I. So here we have this person that John is really trying to construct this. Basically, this guy is God, and he is so elevated. And then that same guy goes, you're going to do even better things than me.
Right.
Like, that's amazing, is that, like, all these amazing things that we see in John, Jesus is empowering us to do even greater things than that.
Right. Absolutely. And, you know, the best leaders within anarchist spaces and movements work to make themselves replaceable and replaced, right? The mindset is always, how can I make myself so obsolete, in the sense of, I want to empower other people to be able to do the same kinds of things and greater things than what I'm doing. And that's how you build everyone's power to the point where that kind of society can work. And so, yeah, I love that you brought that connection with the Gospel of John specifically.
Can you talk a little bit about some of the examples throughout Christian history that we see of maybe anarchist communities? I'm specifically thinking of like Dorothy Day and the Catholic worker movement, right? And so she very clearly was identified, she identified herself as an anarchist. Are there, maybe you want to talk a little bit about Dorothy Day's communities, but do you want to talk about maybe some of the other ones that you can think of that are very specifically like a Christian community that also has kind of these anarchist commitments?
Absolutely. And it's so funny that you mentioned Dorothy Day, because I am in the
Yeah.
middle of reading her biography written by her granddaughter. So I'm just now getting to the point where the Catholic worker is getting started, and I'm really enjoying it. But yeah, you can rewind all the way back to the Acts 2 early church community, and you have those two famous passages, Acts 2 and Acts 4, where it says they shared everything in common. Everyone sold their private possessions and donated the proceeds to the community. They took care of widows, took care of orphans, made sure everybody's needs were met. So you have that sort of blueprint, and then you have all these different Christian intentional communities throughout history that have looked to that as an inspiration. Starting, you could start with the like monastic communities, beginning in the Middle Ages, where sure, there's definitely still aspects of hierarchy and whatnot, but you also have people renouncing their former lives, renouncing their possessions, holding everything in common, building a life together, creating affinity groups where you share all aspects of your life. And so, yeah, there have been, actually just read this book called Everyday Utopia about various utopian communities that have formed throughout history, and the author makes several references to various Christian communities that took radical steps to construct this kind of lifestyle. And I can't think of any particular names or particular communities right now, but they all sort of had this common thread of stepping back from mainstream society, stepping away from the like exchange economy, as we talked about earlier, moving towards ways of living that were more reciprocal, that shared everything in common. And so, yeah, there's definitely a lot of specific examples that I wish I could remember right now to share with the audience. But yeah, overall, it's those are the kinds of things that you can find within the tradition if you look, and if you know where to look.
Right. Well, I mean, I think of even like some of the Anabaptist traditions. I grew up near the Hutterites. I don't know if you're familiar with the Hutterites. They're somewhat similar to the Amish, except they use electricity. And the Hutterites. Yeah, I remember growing up, being like, growing up in a very conservative evangelical world where my dad was like very anti-communist, and he was like, well, the Hutterites are pretty communist actually, and the only reason why they work is because they only keep their communities less than 250 people or whatever it was, right? Like that's the only reason why, is because they keep it small enough. And it's like, okay, well, what if it was like 500 people and they actually agreed on all these commitments or whatever? And then like, what if that worked? And then what if it was like 1,000? You were like, those were always my little like ideas that I had in my mind. I'm like, well, is it really just like, there's like some sort of like thing that happens right when you get to 250 where all of a sudden it gets all messed up and you have to resort to capitalism? Is that
Right.
what happens? So anyway, but I think of a lot of those Anabaptist communities being
Hmm.
kind of an example of a sort of like shared common. Now, with that said, I will say, like, the Hutterites are very hierarchical in a lot of ways,
Hmm.
and I would imagine a lot of those Baptist communities. So they aren't maybe the best example of
Hmm.
anarchism, because there are definitely some hierarchies that are involved there. But it is to say that there is this like this mutuality that happens between people in those communities that I
Hmm.
think is starting to resonate a little bit with what we're talking about here with anarchism.
For sure.
So, I'd love to hear a little bit about, for the average listener who's like, this all sounds great. I want to get involved in whatever ways I can with this kind of anarchist philosophy and commitment. What would it look like just on a daily practice? Like, does it literally look as simple as, borrowing your sugar to your next door neighbor when they need some sugar for making cookies, or like, what does it look like in everyday practice? For somebody who's like, just the average person, just
Hmm.
like trying to make it in life. What does it look like to at least maybe start to embody some of these anarchist practices?
Right. Absolutely. Yeah. And I go into a few examples of anarchy in action in the last chapter of my book. And the examples that I look at are all instances of communities coming together to solve their own needs without appeal to rulers.
Mm,
And so I look at a community watch line that existed in a community that I lived in previously, where, instead of calling the police for in an instance of a microaggression or profiling or something like that, you call this watch line and you have people that are there to listen to your story, to respond to you, kind of just acting as that first line of response and solidarity.
mhm.
Um, and so that was something that I realized well into it, that, oh yeah, this is an example of people coming together to meet their own needs. I also talk briefly about restorative justice programs in New Jersey, and how that's similarly a way of, instead of channeling people into the legal system with its coercive methods, punitive methods, you direct them into a process where you really get to know the whole person,
Mhm.
the whole
Mhm.
the whole of the persons involved. You allow a hurt person to participate in the process of justice, which often doesn't happen in our mainstream system. And you allow the community together to come up with a solution of how to repair harm in a way that restores all people involved, ideally.
Mhm.
Um, so yeah, there's sort of like the level where an average everyday person could look into these kinds of things that may exist near them and get involved. But then, even on a more smaller, on a smaller scale, oftentimes it can look like um, changing practices within your own interpersonal relationships within your family. If anarchism is the art of relating freely as equals, then it could be a matter of sharing household chores more equitably, or it could be
Mhm.
creating an intentional community where you reverse this sort of trend of atomization and isolation that we experience, and give up some of that independence that we're taught to crave and to hold as ideal, in favor of creating a chosen family,
Mhm.
where you share responsibilities, where you treat each other as equals, where you make decisions by consensus. So that's something that I'm working on right now. I'm getting involved with a group here in New Jersey that is looking to start one or more eco villages, which are intentional communities structured around sustainability. so, yeah, it's in many ways, it's scary thinking about, moving into a community where I don't have as much of the independence or privacy that I have now living alone, sharing resources, sharing my time with people that start out as strangers. But the pull and the appeal of it for me is having that kind of like extended family feel that I feel like a lot of our like parents and grandparents had, with knowing their neighbors and being able to like send the kids over to the neighbor's house if they need help with childcare one day, and those kinds of things. So just it to me, it's exciting as a way to sort of recreate that. But that's a more formal way of creating intentional community, and there's tons of more informal ways to do that as well.
I'm glad you bring that up, that this sort of like idea that we have of people when, however many years ago, where like you send kids out and they get the sugar from your neighbor when you need some sugar for baking or whatever it is. But like specifically children involved in this, right? I think to myself of like my own experience growing up as a child and having a lot of neighbors around where there was kids my age, and we would just like go to their house and say, "Hey, can so-and-so play?" And you start to just like get to know your neighbors, because you're just like, you just show up and you knock and say, "Hey, I want to play with you." And let's go play some basketball, or let's go run around the neighborhood, or whatever it is, right?
Yeah.
And there's just something like innate about like children kind of being anarchists in ways where they don't feel this like necessary exchange that has to happen in order to for them to live. Like they just sort of are like, "Hey, this is the thing I'm good at," or like, "This is what I enjoy, and I want you to be a part of this too." And kids just, in a lot of ways, are like the best gateway for, especially as a parent, to like get to know your other neighbors and then start to care about those neighbors. Like there's just something, this sort of like innate energy that kids have for kind of being anarchists, and then getting everybody else involved in getting to know their neighbors and caring about each other.
Yeah. And if your basic needs are met as a child, whose food and clothes are provided by a parent, then just as we were talking about earlier, that kind of frees you up to do the things you love simply because you love them, and to relate to the people around you simply because they're around you, as opposed to like seeing them as instrumental towards meeting your needs. Right. Because that's kind of the way as adults that we're forced to view people, of like, okay, I need to like meet people that can like, I can network with, or people that can advance me in my career, or people that can advance me in my personal plans for my life. As opposed to like, no, you're the person that lives right here next to me, and we have this cul-de-sac, and let's play wiffle ball.
Right. Yeah. There's something like, if every relationship just became like an instrument in and of itself, it's just like everybody hates when like their friend starts turning into like, "Well, what can you do for me?" kind of thing. Like nobody likes those kind of friends, right? And so, but that's the goal of capitalism, is to create every relationship as a instrument onto itself. And so, and nobody likes that. So it's already like, friendship in and of itself is inherently like anti-capitalist and inherently sort of anarchist in a lot of ways, because it's just about mutual relationship.
Oh, 100%. Yeah.
Last couple questions here, Terry. How do you hope this book inspires and liberates its readers?
Yeah. I think I have seen a lot of progressive and maybe even radical theology around particular topics in the past few years, whether it be around identity, whether it be around the Bible in particular, particular topics within Christian belief, but I haven't yet found a progressive or radical systematic theology. And when I say systematic, I mean trying to build a coherent system where the different tenets or the different areas of Christian belief are brought together in a way that that makes sense and that holds together. And so I think that's one of my main hopes with this book, is to offer to this community and sort of this movement of Christians that are doing this reconstructing work, this recontextualizing work within themselves and kind of within their online communities and their churches and whatnot. As I want to offer the book as a resource to them to be able to say, okay, I've started to believe this about the Bible and this about God and this about humanity, to be able to see, okay, and this is how these two things can hold together, and this is how these two topics can mutually reinforce one another. So that's one of the things that I hope to offer. And I'm more of a systematic thinker than maybe some people are, and so that might be more of a liberating thing to people who might be wired a little bit more like me. But I think for everyone, I hope to inspire them just with this basic idea that God is not a ruler, that God is not a dominator, that God is not coercive, but that God is someone who created us for the very purpose of working alongside us, collaborating with us, and most importantly, being our friend. And that affirmation, I think, opens up so many ways of relating to God and relating to Christianity that I hope sort of act as a boost and a buoy to people who need it.
Love it. Love it. Last question, Terry. How can listeners get connected to you and your work, and where should they buy the book? Or
Yes.
steal it?
Yeah, exactly. Funny you mentioned that. Along my anarchist journey, I've been reading a lot of books that are on the Anarchist library, which is this website that has just like PDFs, pirated PDFs of anarchist works from all the way back to like Peter Kropotkin, all the way to the most recent publications from AK Press. So it was like a dream of mine to finally see my book up there available for free. Yes. So people could just get it at any time for free. But until that happens, starting on May 28th, folks can buy it wherever you buy books online. It'll be published through Broadleaf Books. And in the meantime, and afterwards, folks can check out my Instagram, Theology Terry, Theology with Terry. And my podcast, Abolishing the State in a Cool Christian Way, where I sort of unpack a lot of the ideas that you and I have explored in this hour.
Heck yeah. Well, I'm going to get subscribed as soon as we finish this interview up. That is awesome. I didn't realize you had a podcast.
Yeah, I've sort of been on a season hiatus, but hopefully once the book comes out, we'll do a walkthrough of the book as part of season 2.
Heck yeah. Well, everybody check that out. That's exciting. So, well, thank you so much, Terry, for chatting more about this. As soon as I saw the book and Broadleaf kind of mentioned it to me, I was like, oh my goodness, this is awesome. And then you have just been even more awesome than I could have ever anticipated. So this is just so exciting. And certainly one of these books where I'm like, everybody needs to read this. I really, truly believe that. So thank you so much for chatting more about it.
Mason, thank you so much for having me on. It's been such an encouragement to get to speak to you after following you from afar across various social medias over the years. And yeah, just really appreciate your interest and your ideas.